Welcome everyone. Today our speaker is Dr. David Medvigy from Princeton University, where he is in the Department of Geosciences. So David Medvigy did his bachelor's degree at Rutgers University in his field was physics. For his doctoral degree, he went to Harvard, where he graduated from the applied physics department. And his doctoral thesis was on developing a model of vegetation or forests for the northeastern United States for the purpose of studying the impact of vegetation, or impact of climate change on forests. And now he's a faculty member at Princeton, and he has conducted a large number of very, very interesting and diverse studies on how climate impacts vegetation and how vegetation impacts climate. And he has made applications over many parts of the world, including parts of Africa. So it is. I have read that many years ago, Edward Lorenz said that if a butterfly moves in Brazil, it affects precipitation in Texas, right? So David is going to show us that actually changes in the Amazon forest do affect precipitation in North America. So let us welcome David Medvigy.
Okay, thank you, Sultan, for the very nice introduction. And thank you all for coming this afternoon to listen to me talk. I appreciate it. This is my first time here at Stony Brook, and I'm excited to be here. I've already had some nice conversations this morning, and I'm really looking forward to continue to speak with people later this afternoon. But before then, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the ideas that I've been thinking about for the past few years, mainly related to Amazon deforestation and its effect on the atmosphere. So just a little bit of motivation as to why we care about the Amazon. The Amazon is an awesome, awesome place. So certainly in a climatic sense, but also in a biological sense, and also in the socioeconomic sense and biogeochemical sense. And I just wanted to give you a few key statistics to give you an idea of the scale of some of the processes going on here. So it's the largest watershed in the world. And on the basin average, the Amazon typically gets about 2.5 meters per year of precipitation. So huge. It constitutes a large fraction of global runoff, and biologically, it is rightly famous for its biodiversity. In terms of carbon storage, it stores about 10 years worth of anthropogenic CO2 emissions, so 120 petagrams of carbon, mainly in the wood of the trees. The Amazon is also a place that is rapidly changing, and this graph is already a few years old, but it gives you still, I think, a decent sense of the rate of the processes that are going on. You have your rate of clearing in this dashed curve here. This graph only goes to about 2004. In more recent years, the rate of clearing has been closer to around here, due in part to the conservation efforts of the Brazilian government. If you're thinking about the total amount of forests that has been cleared, by around 2004, we're only left with about 78% of pristine forest. Some of the forest that was cleared has begun to regrow, and so if you account for that regrowth, you could say that a little more than 80% of the landscape is actually forested as of around 2004. And so how is this picture going to change in the future? Bertoldo Soros-Vila has been very active in running socioeconomic simulations to try to understand how deforestation will continue and proceed into the deeper into the Amazon basin. And this map gives their best projections for the year 2050. So that would be 36 years from now. Red areas are already deforested, and the yellow and the orange areas are projected to be deforested by 2050. Overall, it's a little more than 40% of the landscape, mainly in the southeast. So the scale of deforestation is going to be huge in our lifetimes. So why is deforestation important? It's a nice little diagram that links together effects on climate, effects on hydrology, effects on biology, economic effects, etc. There's just a tremendous list here of the ways that deforestation is affecting humanity and the Earth system. And so for this talk, I'm going to be focusing on how deforestation affects climate. So that's the general picture. I want to give just a brief overview of the relevant processes involved. You could think of a simple energy balance model to understand how deforestation will affect climate. In general, you have some net radiation coming down. During the daytime, at least, some of this radiation is used to heat up the land surface, and the rest of the energy from the net radiation goes into your sensible and latent heat fluxes to heat up the atmosphere to evaporate water. When you have deforestation, when you convert the landscape to pasture, the sizes of these arrows all change. First of all, your net radiation is reduced, mainly because the albedo increases when you convert to pasture, so you have less energy to work with. Your roughness length decreases, and so your aerodynamic resistance increases. And as a result, the land surface is less tightly coupled to the atmosphere, and so the storage flux will increase when you have pasture relative to when you have forest. Also, when you convert to pasture, you greatly reduce the amount of leaf area that you have, and you reduce the rooting depth of plants, and so combined, that results in reduced latent heat fluxes. What you're left with is sensible heat fluxes, and they could go either way, slight increases or decreases. And so this is a purely local effect of deforestation. There could also be changes in circulations, and that I'll be talking about shortly. But first, I want to review how these changes in energy budgets and also the water budget is expected to affect hydroclimate in the Amazon. And so these are the results of old paper by Shukla, Carlos Nobre et al. From 1990 in Science. And what they did was run GCM simulations for a control case where you have the Amazon as a forest, and a counterpart simulation where they deforested the entire Amazon as represented by the shaded area in this map. And what they basically found is that your temperature increases in the deforested area by a few degrees, and your precipitation changes by a rather huge amount, up to 800 millimeters per year in some locations. And this is mainly driven by the change in energy and water balances that I just described on the last slide. Your latent heat flux goes down, and so you have reduced evaporative cooling, and so things heat up. You also have less water in the atmosphere, and so you have reduced precipitation. And so those are some impacts that people have been expecting in the Amazon for a long time. But how will deforestation affect other parts of the world? This, I think, has been a much more controversial question. An early study that tried to address the problem of non-local effects of deforestation was published in GRL, Gideon de Valdez, from 2000. You know, it's really tough to see their map outlined here, and so I tried to point out a few locations. But this is the northern hemisphere, and what's being shown is the effect of deforestation on the 150 hectopascal stream function. And so in their simulations, you could see that there is a rather large effect pronounced throughout the northern hemisphere, extratropics. And in their study, they found the strongest effects in December, January, February season, which corresponds to the wet season for most of the Amazon. And so you have potentially some changes in atmospheric circulations. Other studies have looked at how you may have changes in precipitation in other parts of the world. And so this is some work by Ronnie Avasar, Dave Worth, where they did a similar thing. They had simulations with a pristine Amazon and simulations with a deforested Amazon. And they looked for statistically significant changes in precipitation in each grid cell for each month of the year. And what's being shown here are the grid cells that have at least 3 months of statistically significantly different precipitation. And so, as an example, you see there's a strong hotspot in the Amazon. So they're saying the Amazon was strongly affected for at least 3 months. And this is the seasonal cycle of precipitation for one grid cell for the forested case in green and the deforested case in red. And for most months of the year, you could see this big change. They also identified potential non-local effects, and they highlighted this hotspot around Texas, where they found changes in precipitation, especially during the wetter months. But the signals in other parts of the northern hemisphere extratropics are relatively sparse. There have been other studies that have continued to look for extratropical effects, and so this is some work done by Kirsten Findell and others at GFDL. Again, focusing on the December, January, February season and looking at changes in precipitation. I think they found some very fascinating results here. First of all, in the Amazon, they found that deforestation actually increased precipitation in the west, but decreased precipitation in the east. Most previous studies have found simple decreases in precipitation. So here, they're among the first to identify some redistribution of precipitation. In terms of differences. Oh, I should also mention that in this particular study, they deforested not only the Amazon, but the global tropical rainforests. And so that's why you see a signal in Africa and in Asia. The whole area was deforested. If you look for extratropical areas that were affected in terms of rainfall, you perhaps see something in Alaska and perhaps in British Columbia, but otherwise not too much. In this particular study, they concluded that the extratropical impacts may be there, but they're difficult. But it's difficult to obtain statistically significant results in the face of all of the natural climate variability. So you need really long simulations or something to be able to see them. And so I was interested in this because, on the one hand, you have the contrast between the results of Gedney and Valdez, which showed that there's this dynamical effect on the stream function, but some of these other studies that are sort of ambiguous in whether there could be extratropical effects. And so I first wanted to back up a little bit from the problem and see if there is something that all of these studies could potentially be missing. What is it that we're not understanding? And if we're going to make progress on this, we don't necessarily just want to throw another simulation at it, but is there a way that we could possibly analyze this problem in a little bit of a smarter way? And so, to give you a bit of a teaser, I'm showing South America here, the topography at different grid resolutions. And so in the upper left, you have a uniform 400-kilometer grid, and then the resolution increases and down to 50 kilometers in the lower right. And so you could see that there's just a dramatic change in the way that the Andes are represented as you increase your resolution. And most previous studies were sort of in this range of deforestation. It's a fairly typical GCM resolution. And so I was concerned about the effect of partially missing the Andes on interpreting our results. The other thing that I found very interesting came from the AR4, the IPCC report. Here's their maps of observed precipitation and their ensemble average model simulated precipitation. And if you look at what's happening in the Amazon, you see that the models generally have darker colors, which mean they're under-predicting rainfall in the Amazon. And this is true in the ensemble average and for almost all of the models individually in the AR4. None of them get, well, very few of them get enough precipitation in the Amazon. And so, so how to think about these problems and to perhaps address them? Well, to get to the issue of resolving the Andes, one simple way is to go to higher resolution. And a common way of doing that is to switch over to a regional climate model, a mesoscale model, a limited area model, whatever you wish to call it. And so these are the results of one such study by Ronnie Avasar and his group from 2008. And here they ran the RAMS regional model to give you some sense of their resolution. Here's a graph of their topography of South America, and this is also the domain that they simulated. And again, they went through the standard procedure of simulating a forested Amazon and a deforested Amazon, And they compared the precipitation in the two simulations. And the right-hand panel shows the January, February, that is the wet season rainfall anomaly. These simulations also show a regional redistribution of precipitation in response to deforestation. You have less rainfall in the west and more rainfall in the east and the southeast. Overall, there's a net reduction in rainfall still. Okay, so great. Ideally, we'd like to be able to use a high-resolution model like this to determine the extratropical effects of Amazon deforestation. But of course, you can't do that because this is a regional model. By definition, it only simulates a certain domain. You have to apply boundary conditions, etc. And so it might be great for simulating the Amazon by itself, but it's not going to tell you anything about North America. If all you had were GCMs and these regional models, you might be a little bit stuck. It's very computationally expensive to run GCMs at high resolution so that you'd be able to simulate the Andes or other mountain chains or other features of interest. On the other hand, regional models are regional and they require lateral boundary conditions. And so the approach that I've been taking to this problem is using a variable resolution GCM, which has the advantage of being a global model, so it doesn't require lateral boundary conditions and you get the whole globe. But with fine resolution in regions of interest, as illustrated here for the Amazon. And so you might say that we use a computationally efficient coarse resolution in the far field while simulating regions of interest with high resolution. This diagram gives you some idea of how we set up our grid. We start out with an icosahedron, 20 triangles, and then we could subdivide the triangles as many times as we wish to obtain locally fine resolution. So unlike some regional climate models, I just wanted to point out that there's no nesting here. There's no overlapping grids. There's just a single unstructured grid with variable resolution. So you don't have to interpolate between grids or anything like that. Not going to go into too many details about the model, but just to point out some of the features that distinguish it a little bit. Here we're using a Cartesian vertical coordinate with shaved grid cells. That's shown on the right. Unlike what's I think a more common approach of using a terrain following grid. We can talk more about that later if you'd like. And so one of the first applications of this model was to see if we could capture the magnitude and the interannual variability of rainfall in the Amazon. And so what this graph is showing is the January-February rainfall. These are the wettest months in the Amazon. And the lines show different observational data sets, including GPCP, CMAP, various trim products. First thing you might notice is not all the observations agree with each other. There's certainly a degree of uncertainty in the observations. But what all the observations do agree on is that of these 4 years, 1998 is the wettest. And this year was strongly affected by El Nino. And typically in the Amazon, what we'd expect is that you'd have drier, you'd have reduced rainfall during El Nino years. And that's in the observations. The only model simulation here is the black curve. This was created by simulating the Andes in particular at a 50-kilometer resolution and the far field at a 200-kilometer resolution. It turns out that we do capture this reduction in rainfall when we simulate the Andes at this fine resolution. Overall, the magnitudes of the modeled precipitation rates are comparable to the observations. We also tried simulating all of these various scenarios with resolutions ranging between 400 kilometers and 25 kilometers. And what we found out was that El Nino years are only actually dry if you use a resolution of about 50 kilometers or finer. And so we concluded that if we wanted good simulations of the Amazon to be able to capture basic things like the effects of El Nino, we would need at least 50-kilometer resolution. Okay. So moving on to some discussion of our simulations of deforestation. These graphs are showing our representation of land cover, this time at 25-kilometer resolution over South America. The green map represents, or the left-hand graph here represents our control scenario, with the green color representing tropical rainforest. We also created an extreme deforestation scenario where we deforested all of the rainforest between the equator and about 12 degrees of latitude south. And so our idea was to run simulations with these two configurations and see what the effects are for the rainfall. And so the simulations we ran were for about 15 years, forced with sea surface temperatures from the, I believe, 1996 to around 2010. And so then this graph illustrates the changes that we found in rainfall, with the purple colors indicating reductions in rainfall and the greener colors representing increases in rainfall. And so we have reductions in the west and increases in the east and southeast. And we found this result to be gratifying because this actually agrees pretty well with the results from the limited area model that was published a few years earlier with that showed decreases, especially in the northwest, and increases in the southeast. So the models had completely different dynamic cores. One was regional, one's global, and so there's no guarantee that we'd get a similar result. Interestingly, we repeated our analysis using globally coarse resolution of 200 kilometers. And in this case, you don't see this regional redistribution of precipitation. Instead, you just see a reduction in precipitation through most of the Amazon, which is consistent actually with most of the global studies, global GCM studies. Okay, so now I want to move on and talk about how deforestation might affect the rest of the world, and want to start by bringing up this classic paper, Hoskins and Crowley, 1981. And so in this paper, the authors describe how heating, and one of the things they described is how a heating anomaly located in the tropics could impact the extratropics. And so 2 graphs from this paper, this shaded region shows the location of their thermal anomaly, and then the contours show the perturbation in their 300 millibar height fields. And then on the right-hand side, you also see the vorticity anomalies in their simulations. And so this suggests that there is a mechanism whereby anomalies in the tropics could propagate into the extratropics. So if you have some heating anomaly, it could happen. And interestingly, well, not many studies have calculated the changes in tropospheric temperatures or thicknesses when analyzing Amazon deforestation. So we don't have such a good idea of how much of a column integrated or troposphere integrated heating anomaly there actually was in those simulations. One of the few that actually computed this was Findell et al., and they did find heating throughout the tropical troposphere. And so this may at least be a plausible scenario, an avenue worth exploring. At least that was my initial thought. The other thing that I was thinking about when I started this analysis was whether there might be some analogy to El Nino. So El Nino is another thing that we all know about. It causes a heating anomaly in the tropical troposphere, and it has well-known teleconnections. And so this graph shows the correlation between an El Nino index and rainfall. You can see it's a complicated pattern here, but there are several hot spots, certainly over the Pacific, but also over the western US. Several of you know this, I think, much better than I do, but in recent years there's been a growing appreciation that there are different kinds of El Ninos. You get El Ninos in the central Pacific and El Ninos with their epicenter in the eastern Pacific. It turns out that it doesn't much matter where the epicenter in your El Nino is if you're interested in rainfall over the northwestern US. Consistently, regardless of where the El Nino is located, the northwestern US is dry. And so I had the crazy idea of if the heating's not in the Pacific but a little bit further east, would you also see a dry anomaly in the northwestern US? Just an idea to explore. And so, yeah, okay, so this is some graphs showing average anomalies in precipitation during El Nino years. Northwestern US is dry, California and Southwest is wet, and corresponding strong impacts on snow water equivalent. So set up a few model simulations, and these graphs show the grids and the topography. And we set up a few model configurations on purpose so that we could make sure that our results are not too sensitive to exactly what we chose for our grid. And so in our first case, we were using 25-kilometer resolution over the western US and 50 over the Andes and the Amazon. And then we had 2 other cases where we had 50 kilometers in both the western US and the Andes. And then in the third case, we used enhanced vertical resolution, but with the same 50-50 kilometer grid. And then sort of as a ringer, as some sort of foil for comparison, we also performed what would be a standard case of a uniform 200 kilometer resolution grid mesh. And for each of these configurations, we ran with simulations with a forested Amazon and a deforested Amazon. And each simulation ran for 15 years as an atmospheric GCM. So sea surface temperatures were prescribed in all simulations. Just another neat graph showing what the global grid looks like. I'm afraid I had a little error in my plotting algorithm, and so you see the Greenwich line didn't come out quite right, but at least you could see the fine resolution over the Andes in the west.
How many vertical levels you have?
90, I think. So in our default case, we start out with a 200 meter resolution near the ground and through most of the boundary layer, and then it gradually gets coarser as you move up to about 45 kilometers.
You have shade grid, right?
Correct.
So you have, for US, gently sloping surface.
Yes.
You have like that.
Yep.
Do you have some rain anomalies along those lines?
I'm sorry?
Do you have some artificial rain along those lines?
So I
Some kind of bias? Do you see those? Just
we
curious.
have not seen anything like that. We've done test cases down to 8 kilometer resolution, comparing against weather stations, and there's no strong evidence for that. You know, I can't say that there's no effect, but.
That's good.
Yeah, and we've compared to cases where we've gone down as fine as 30 meters in vertical resolution near the surface. So another recent thing we did was switch over to a hexagonal mesh. It's somewhat better numerical properties than triangles. It's just the dual grid, so once you have the triangles, this mesh is easy to configure. And so I want to show you now our simulations of precipitation for the US for December, January, February period compared to an observational, a gridded data set. And so this is the data set that takes weather station data and converts it to a gridded product. This is one of our variable resolution simulations. And for the Western US, we could see that you have nice features, California, the Sierra Mountains, reproduced in the simulations. You have Western Oregon, Washington, not bad. Certainly you have some biases as you move into the Rockies. Probably, I suspect that continuing to enhance vertical resolution might help alleviate that. And then the Eastern US, I'm not going to talk so much about today, but there's a little bit more of a bias. And just as a comparison, this is what we get if we run with a globally uniform coarse resolution. We miss quite a few of the details in the West. Also interesting to look at simulated snow water equivalent average over 15 years for April 1st. And our variable resolution simulations are able to capture substantial snowpack in the Sierra, whereas of course our resolutions at 200 kilometer resolution really aren't able to capture much of anything. Okay, so this graph is, I think, one of the punchlines of the talk. showing the change in December, January, February precipitation, deforested minus forested. So this is the effect of deforestation. Purple indicates precipitation reductions. Green would indicate precipitation increases. And so what we see, western US, northwestern US, sorry, strong decreases, about 1 millimeter a day. Interestingly, these decreases extend down into California. And so this is both like and unlike El Nino, whereas El Nino would give you precipitation reductions here and increases here. In the case of Amazon deforestation, we're seeing decreases everywhere. The hatching is indicating statistical significance, assuming that all of the 15 years of this simulation represent independent samples. Since we had several different simulation pairs with different grid resolutions in both the horizontal and vertical, I think that we could generate a more powerful result. So you could ask if all of these simulations give precipitation reductions in the northwestern US. And in fact, the answer to that is yes. And this graph shows the ensemble average precipitation reduction in the northwestern US and California. And the hatching indicates each year in each simulation is an independent sample. But again, all the simulations are hovering around 1 millimeter a day precipitation reduction. Interestingly, if you pull up the simulation that was done at coarse resolution, we see nothing like this at all. There are precipitation reductions, but they're occurring Texas, Oklahoma, and they're relatively small. So why is, before we get into why, just wanted to also mention that these precipitation reductions are associated with changes in snowpack on April 1st. And so this is the case where you have a forested Amazon. This is the case with the deforested Amazon. And these changes in snowpack are important because this is the water that farmers in the Central Valley are going to use to irrigate their crops. And so now I want to get a little bit into the question of why. And so here's another map showing precipitation differences in South America resulting from deforestation. And again, this particular simulation pair, we see this redistribution of precipitation, more in the north, reduction in the north and increase in the south. These precipitation changes are associated with changes in the dynamics. And so this is now the 500 hectopascal vertical velocity difference between the deforested case and the forested case. And as you might expect, where it gets drier, your average vertical velocity is decreased. Where it gets wetter, your average vertical velocity is increased. So if you like, you might envision secondary circulation developing here, where you have upward motion over the southern Amazon and downward motion over the northern Amazon. And so you could go and calculate the vorticity of that circulation, but perhaps it's not a big deal because it's a horizontal vorticity, so who would care about it? I think we should care because there's also substantial wind shear. So this graph is just showing the zonal winds at 500 hectopascal. But the idea is that because of topography, because of the Andes, you have especially strong wind shear. And that shear could be used to tilt your horizontal vorticity anomaly into an anomaly of vertical vorticity. And so, all of a sudden, we've generated the anomalies that, the types of anomalies that Hoskins and Caroli were talking about in 1981. And so we could look deeper into our simulations and ask how things like the meridional wind has changed in a deforested case relative to a forested case. And that's shown in these graphs. The purple is a decrease, and the green is an increase. And you see this nice wave structure in the extratropics at 250 hectopascal. There is an especially strong signal over the northwestern US. Over the Amazon, in the deforested region, you have an increase in meridional wind. Just south of the deforested region, I don't know if you can see it, but it's purple. You have a decrease in the meridional wind. That's at high levels. Near the surface, at 850 hectopascal, it's the opposite. You have a decrease over the Amazon and an increase just south. Turns out that this sort of pattern is very similar to what was simulated by Jin and Hoskins back in 1995. Again, a response to a thermal source, this time situated at the equator at 90 degrees west, so right about here. This graph is showing upper level meridional velocity anomalies. And just north of the heating, they have a positive anomaly. Just south, they have a negative anomaly. And so, since we had an ensemble of simulations, we went on to calculate the locations where there's a statistically significant anomaly in the meridional velocity at 250 pascal among all simulations. And this is the map that we come up with. Again, you can see that the simulations are consistent in where they put these waves in the extratropics in both the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. If you do a similar analysis for our simulation that used globally coarse resolution, well, you see waves, but they're actually out of phase with all of the waves from the high resolution simulations. So if you focus in on the northwestern US, you could see the sequence of purple, green, purple, whereas in the high resolution you have green, purple, green. This I already mentioned. And so you have a basic mechanism where you have a redistribution of precipitation that ultimately is leading to these vorticity anomalies, wave propagation, and we find precipitation decreases in the northwestern US. So that is all I was going to say about the impacts on the northwestern US. I have just a few minutes left, and so I just wanted to bring up another fun project that I worked on, perhaps you'd be interested in, that also has to do with deforestation, but this time with extreme events. And in particular, extreme, well, you might say it's a bit of a stretch to call it extreme, but extreme cold events in South America. And so here we have basically the price of coffee futures. And if you track the daily variation in price, you can see that there's a point where they shoot up around the weekend of the 25th of June. And they shoot up because you have one of these extreme cold events penetrating into southern South America, and you get a freeze in many places in southern Brazil. And this has very negative implications for the coffee crop. This event was particularly severe, but you do get cold air incursions a few times a year, typically, in southern South America. They don't all lead to freezes. It's just a neat little graph showing the temperature time series of this particular cold air incursion at different places in South America. You can see if Foz do Iguaçu, it gets down to -1 degree Celsius. And the basic situation is that high pressure system coming in from the Pacific can't pass over the Andes, so it goes around it, gets channeled up the eastern flank of the Andes. Sometimes they split into two branches, one along the Andes and then one further, moves further east. And this brings with it cold front. And so we had to come up with, and so I was interested in the effect of deforestation on these cold air incursions into South America. And so we had to come up with some metric of how to quantify a cold air event, a cold air incursion. I don't have time to go into the details, but basically we just looked at the 5th percentile of temperatures, of daily average temperature, and did an EOF analysis to determine where we would have regional scale cold events. And so we did, again, 15-year simulations with our variable resolution model. In this case, we had 25-kilometer resolution over most of South America. And this is our composite cold air incursion extracted from this 15-year simulation. The graph showed the temperature anomalies all on the same scale here. And so you could see comes in from the south, proceeds equatorward, splits into two branches before finally dissipating. So pretty close to the standard observational picture. So we did our deforestation simulations as before, and this is pretty much the punchline of this study. So here I'm plotting the change in the frequency of extreme cold events on the left-hand side. Green means more frequent, red means less frequent. There's some action in the Amazon that might be expected because we deforested the Amazon, so there'll be changes there. What we were a little bit surprised to see are changes further south in South America. Increases of several cold events per year. We also found that the cold events could become more intense. So you could think of this as your characteristic intensity of the characteristic temperature of the cold event, and it decreases wherever the frequency increased. And so they're colder by about 1 degree in southern South America. And so I could just say a few words about what I think is driving these changes. It's sort of, to me, it's very interesting because ordinarily we think of deforestation of the Amazon as having a warming effect. So what's going on with cold air incursions? Well, this graph shows the simulated change in temperature at 850 hectopascals in response to deforestation. And in fact, in most of the Amazon, we do see a temperature increase, as we might have expected. Temperature increase extends down to at least 10 degrees south. And so you're warming the equator, but not directly doing anything to mid-latitudes. So you're changing your latitudinal temperature gradient. And so, yep.
Could you just tell we oceanographers, what altitude are you talking about, 850?
Say 1,500 meters.
So it's low.
Yeah. So you're changing your latitudinal temperature gradient, and in the most basic way, you can think of the connection to a thermal wind. You might change the position of strong winds. And so this graph shows the simulated 300 hectopascal winds. So this you might think of as your jet stream, subtropical jet. This is in your control simulation. And after deforestation, this is the change. What happens is that you have a decrease in wind speed to the south and an increase in the wind speed in the north. And so that means your jet shifted northward in response to deforestation. And so there are different ways you can think about the possible implications of this. We often think about the jet exit region here as being associated with jet streaks, which result in a secondary circulation with upward motion on the equatorward flank of the jet and downward motion on the poleward side of the jet. Have to be careful speaking about this when thinking about the southern hemisphere. And so that's also what we simulate. And so if you have downward motion, especially on the poleward side of the jet, that would strengthen your lower level anticyclonic vorticity and therefore your high pressure systems that are associated with these cold air incursions. So sorry I rushed through that a little bit. And so just want to leave you with a few things that I think are going to require more thought. So all of these simulations were done with atmosphere-only GCMs, so we have no ocean feedbacks. Convective parameterizations, cloud parameterizations, as always, are an issue. So we tested our model against the various radiation and precipitation data sets, but who knows if it's would continue to work properly under a deforested scenario. We haven't included any impacts of greenhouse gases, and we've mostly analyzed very simple deforestation scenarios where we've deforested most of the Amazon. In fact, reality is going to be more complicated. We're also thinking about applying this analysis to other parts of the world. So just want to close then by thanking my collaborators and NSF and Princeton for computational support. And thank you all.
So we have time for a couple of few questions. Let me yes, Nicholas.
Oh, yes. These changes in precip that you showed over your simulations, were those averaged over 15 years?
Correct.
And would you say that there might be a trend if you were to look at the individual years to say that maybe some areas will be receiving progressively more and more rain and progressively less?
There is no trend. At least no statistically significant trend.
Okay.
Yeah, just want to ask sort of more philosophical question about this sort of variable grid.
Yeah.
Because conceptually, I can see that it seems to me that it's not that conceptually different from sort of a two-way nested grid. And Ruby Lam actually gave a very nice talk at the AGU, and actually I have previously had the same type of thoughts. It's about if you put a very high resolution grid over a particular domain, you may, well, one of the problems that it could actually distort the global circulation because you are resolving that region well, for example, the mountains.
Yep.
You are resolving the mountains
Yep.
over the, for example, the US
Yep.
better, but then you have a very coarse resolution over the Tibet.
Yep.
So you are sort of degrading the global interaction of the stationary wave. So it could actually turn out that your basic state actually becomes worse if you do that, and then your wave propagation would change.
Yeah.
Especially if you are looking for remote impact.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that is something that I think I wholeheartedly think needs to be investigated. What we've done in our analysis, it's not for 15 years because that's expensive, but for shorter amounts of time, compare global high resolution runs, global coarse resolution runs, and variable resolution runs. We don't see much evidence of this sort of effect that you bring up, at least in the context of our deforestation results. But it's definitely something that we need to think about.
So thank you.
Yes, I got two questions actually. First one, in the very beginning, you showed a map for the deforestation with red colors. Those red colors will be the worst. To me, those colors do not show a pattern, which is spatial pattern. It just shows some like a river basin type of red colors. Would that be called?
Wait, you mean at the very beginning?
Near, pretty much close. A map for the deforestation.
This?
Yes, that one.
Yes.
We see those red colors.
Yes.
They're not have a pattern or concentrated pattern.
That's right, that's
Or-
right.
yes.
They follow the roads.
Yes,
They
or
follow
this
roads.
to show that probably the overcutting of the trees will be responsible for this deforestation as well. I mean, people have cut just too many trees.
Yeah, so that's exactly what happens here. So the deforestation is a replacement of trees with typically first agriculture for a couple of years, and then after the soil gets degraded, pasture, so grasses. Eventually, in principle, the forest should reclaim the landscape. And they're slowly doing it, but very slowly, because the soil has been depleted of all of its nutrients and compacted.
So actually, there's very little contribution from natural variability to this deforestation.
From what, I'm sorry?
Natural variability, for example.
Nitrogen availability?
I mean, natural.
Natural variability.
Yes.
Yep.
It's little. There's little contribution from natural variability to this deforestation.
Yeah, so this graph is just a pure anthropogenic
Okay.
projection.
Great. Second one about you relate the reduction of precipitation to the 500 millibar vertical velocity.
Yes.
Does it imply the convection over the Amazon basin primarily consists of the deep convection? Or
Yeah, so yeah, I was just using the vertical velocity as some metric of convection. I mean, certainly you could go into give a more complicated picture of what's actually happening there.
right, because there's several actually GCMs, CTCMs, which you just showed, verified models also has substantially underestimated the precipitation there. So, well, it's probably some other contributions as well to the total precipitation.
Yeah, I agree. It's not the full story, but I think it's an important component.
Right. Thank you.
So Malcolm,
This is a policy question. It's a hypothetical question, but on this Monday, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry announced that climate change will be the #1 priority of the Department of State and the balance of the Obama administration, and he is in his work around the world, he's going to encourage all the other countries of the world to make climate change the number one priority. This is sort of a profound change in the U.S. position to become the world leader. And supposing he asks you to testify, to advise him to testify before Congress about what you see the three biggest priorities, important priorities regarding deforestation in the Amazon and its effect on the U.S.
So remember
Are you coming to lunch?
Let's wait for lunch.
So remember you are under oath when you are.
Seriously, we wait for lunch, but Bob has a question.
So Bob, yes.
I'm wondering if you can relate these patterns to actual runoff from the continents into the ocean.
Oh, I think that would be super interesting to attempt to do. Right now, I don't trust the runoff parameterizations in the models. I don't know enough about them, except that what we're using now is very simple. Yeah, I think that would be great to do, but we haven't done it yet.
Yes, Tom.
You just kind of curious. So, kind of same question actually. Where all this water come from? Are they mostly just local recycle, or they actually come from very large area?
Yeah.
Oceans?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Traditionally, the idea is that about 50% of the water comes to the Amazon from the ocean, and about 50% is recycled. So, in other words, precipitation is about twice your evaporation. This changes when you have deforestation. When you have deforestation, you have a group, well, at least in our simulations, you see a stronger component of moisture convergence of input from the ocean and a reduced component from evaporation.
And they're most from Atlantic or from Pacific?
Atlantic, yes. Yeah, absolutely, because the Andes block it. Yeah.
Okay, so let us thank David Medvigy.
Number one priority. If you were God, Bob. Well, to tell humanity.